This time it's our second meeting here at the Humboldt University, and I'm glad to have here Gregory Gilles from the King's College in London. He has quite an interesting curriculum vitae, as he comes originally from Australia, and he made his BA in classics at the University of Queensland in Australia, and then he changed to the motherland, to the United Kingdom, and made his masters in classics at the Reading University. Now he is working on his PhD at the King's College in London, and he's working on, which is partly related to his talk he's giving today, working on using social network analysis to identify female agency in the late Roman Republic. So one question is, how did the women worked as agents for political ideas, if I understood it correctly? Otherwise, Gregory will be happy to correct me, I would say. And coming to this, the curriculum vitae doesn't seem to be, well, it seems to be quite normal, the normal way, making the BA, making the MA, making the thesis and stuff like this. But now comes the clue, because he has also got degrees in mathematics and teaching. And he worked for 10 years as a mathematics teacher. So if in my institution, the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences, we have now a president who is as well a mathematician, and he's always asking us working in the fields of digital humanities, well, what are the main mathematical approaches you use in your digital editions and stuff like this? And normally he says, well, what you are doing here is the stuff which I learned in my first year of mathematics, and so it is not very valuable what you are doing there. But so he tries to put us in a quite mathematical direction. So I'm quite interested in hearing about applying higher mathematics to the history.
I'm not sure about higher mathematics.
We will see. But what you are talking about is something which is interesting quite as well for me, although I'm not working in the field of the Roman Republic. But you are using a very special source, namely letters, and letters editions are getting very, very popular in the digital humanities, but it is mostly modern letter or pre-modern or early modern letter editions. So here we have letters from the late Roman Republic, and what you are trying to do is to identify how the two autocrats who were struggling with each other at this time, namely Caesar and Pompeius, how they used their family ties and the relations they had to get their armies together, or to get their supporters together. So I'm quite interested in how social network theory can be applied to answer these questions. And I think I will stop here with giving an unclear thought about, because I think you will give a good introduction as well into the broader scope of the time, and as well of your thesis and analysis.
So the talk today is about using social network analysis, and I am doing this for my PhD thesis on women in the late Republic. And I thought I would try it out on something a little bit different to start with and see how it worked. So I've put together a little project about Cicero and using his letters and analysing his letters during the Civil War, which went from 49 to 45 BC. And I've done this in order to ascertain whether senators in the late Roman Republic chose to back either Pompey or Caesar according to family obligations, according to social expectations, or according to political affiliations. And I've tried using only Cicero's, and I have only used Cicero's letters in order to do these little network maps that I've created. And we'll discuss the positives and negatives of that a little bit later. In terms of the main players, there are three. So we have Caesar, Pompey, and Cicero. I'm sure you all know about all three. You know, Caesar and Pompey were autocrats. All three had been senators for a very long time. All three had been consuls in their respective time frames. Pompey is the only one that is a little bit different because he comes straight from military campaigns and jumps straight to the consulship and doesn't really become anything else but a consul, which is quite extraordinary for its time, whereas Caesar and Cicero went through all of the right ways to get to a consul and so forth. All right. In terms of what is happening at the time of the Civil War and just before the Civil War, Pompey is becoming extremely jealous of Caesar's gaining aspirations. Caesar is in Gaul and has been in Gaul for 10 years now, conquering just about everything that there is, making lots of money, creating lots of political affiliations in Rome, which Pompey is very scared of because that's what he used to have. So there's all of these power plays happening. Cicero is overseas for the first time in his life, governing in Asia Minor, so he's out of the picture, whereas he normally likes to stay in Rome and make sure that everything happens according to the way that he wants it to happen, or try to the very best of his ability to anyway. But Cicero is still in contact with everything that happens in Rome through letters, which is what the study is about. So he writes to all of his contacts in Rome. He makes sure that there is one of his friends, which is Gaius, which writes to him every single week, if possible, about all of the events that are happening in Rome, everything that is happening with the Senate, with Caesar, with Pompey, and so forth, so that he's not out of the loop, because Cicero doesn't like to be out of the loop. He likes to be in the center of everything that is political. When we get to about 50 BC, which is when I start the analysis that I did, I read through the letters a couple of years beforehand, and I realized that there is no discussion about the Civil War until we get to about 50 BC. So there was no point in doing the letters from 52, for example, because there would be no discussion on the Civil War at all. And so we get to about 50 BC when Cicero starts discussing with all of his networks of friends and alliances and so forth through his letters about the possibility of civil war between Caesar and Pompey. And that's where I start the analysis. And even though the civil war continues to about 45 BC, Pompey loses in Pharsalus in the end of 48, then goes to Egypt and is murdered, which is not very nice for him, I'm sure. But it kind of ends the major struggle that Cicero faces, which is whether to back Pompey or to back Caesar or to stay completely neutral, which is what he really wants to do. He doesn't want to back either one of them because he's afraid that if he does, he backs the loser and then they're probably going to decapitate him anyway. So he tries his hardest to stay neutral for as long as possible. And so do a lot of the senators in Rome by reading all these letters exchanged between Cicero and his friends. And the ones that write to Cicero, you really see that a lot of them really struggle with what to do. Do I stay neutral? Do I back one of them? Do I back Pompey because he has the Senate's backing? Or do I back Caesar because I think he's probably going to win because he has more manpower? And there is a lot of that in letters, and it's really, really interesting to read that. And I decided to stop the analysis at 47 rather than continue to 45 BC, because beyond 47 BC, there is no more discussion about the Civil War. It's basically ended in terms of the competition between Caesar and Pompey. And the rest of the next 2 years, Cicero's letters are all about making sure his family and his friends are safe and making sure that all of his contacts are still there. And it's no longer really about who will win, because they already know who will win. It's Caesar. Even though it's not quite set in stone yet, Caesar has basically defeated Pompey and Pompey is dead. So the Civil War, the last 2 years, is more about tying loose ends and making sure that Caesar gains complete control. And the letters really don't talk about anything at all regarding the Civil War, so I decided not to include them in my analysis. So that's a brief rundown of what's happening, right? And a little bit about the letters and the reason why I chose to use them as a social analysis study is because they provide such a rich source of information that can be used to create databases, which I'll be looking at later and discussing with you of how I created all these maps and so forth. And it was a really good way for my bigger project, my PhD, could I tackle it? If I could do something smaller, can I do something bigger with them? So I thought I'd try. Right, so to the little bit of formal section, which is about the social network analysis. And so I'm going to discuss social network analysis, how it's used in general a little bit, very brief discussion on that, and then I'll be discussing how it's been used by historians recently, in the context it's been used and so forth. And then I'll be talking about the project that I've done in more detail, the methodology, and then we'll look at a lot of network maps, which hopefully the screen's a bit small, so hopefully you'll get a little bit of detail, or I'll try and explain to you how it works. And then we'll do a general discussion at the end about the analysis that has come out of the letters and the social network use of it, and then whether it is appropriate to use social network analysis on static text such as letters or writings in general and so forth. Okay, right, so one of the most central problems for historians has to do with the question of social order and how individuals interacted and related with one another in order to form effective and enduring societies. Social network theory offers a coherent approach for examining numerous social phenomena, from the spread of cultural innovations to the rise and fall of different political institutions. Social networks are also adept at characterizing dynamic processes, for as individuals form and break certain social ties, they also alter the organizational structure of the networks in which they participate. Social network theory at a basic level allows historians to visualize a node's or an actor's degree of centrality, or alternatively remoteness, in a network, and takes the links between nodes and makes them as important as the nodes themselves for understanding the properties of social change. In contrast to other types of analyses that assume that socialization into norms determines behavior, social network analysis looks to see the extent to which the structure and composition of ties affect norms. The power of this methodological approach stems from its difference from traditional social scientific studies, which assume that it is the attributes of individual actors that matter. Social network analysis produces an alternate view where the attributes of individuals are less important than their relationships and ties with other actors within the network. In the last decade, several studies in the social sciences have shown that these formal methods derived from social network analysis can effectively be applied to selected bodies of historical data. These studies, however, tend to be strongly influenced by standards of data processing and, above all, epistemological paradigms that have their roots in the social sciences. However, from the point of view of a historian like myself, the historical social scientists carrying out these studies do not, in most cases, adequately take into account the limits of historical resources and their often fragmentary and contradictory nature when they use them to extract relationship data. Alongside the scarcity of ancient sources, this has hampered the comprehensive, valid, and meaningful application of methods drawn from social network analysis for some time now. Moreover, most network analysis studies involving the ancient world to date have been done by archaeologists rather than classicists and have usually been concerned with artifacts. Such scholars include Tom Brumans on networks in archaeology, Carl Knappert on material culture, Cyprian Broodbank on island interactions during the Aegean Bronze Age, and Fiona Coward on ancient Near Eastern artifacts. Alongside these, one of the most interesting classical studies was that by Sean Graham on Roman bricklayers in central Italy, where he managed to look at 500 different types of bricks, which sounds really interesting. And the different stamps on the bricks all along the Tiber, from Ostia all the way to Rome, and was able to identify a network of the different bricklayers and how they communicated with each other and how they passed along their bricks all the way up to Rome. It's really quite fascinating, even though it is basically just a study of bricks. And also a frequent collaborator of Sean Graham's, Giovanni Ruffini, also used social network analysis during his research into Byzantine Egypt to provide an example of the potential of such documentary scrutiny in key data-rich periods and environments of the Mediterranean. Studies concerned specifically with texts and ancient history, like the study that I've just done, however, are much fewer. But the few that have been carried out have been spearheaded in recent years by Irad Malkin of Tel Aviv University, and Anna Koller's recent study of religious networks across the Roman world also demonstrates the potential for harnessing the copious epigraphic records that have survived to elucidate social relationships across maritime and non-maritime space. Moreover, in terms of digitizing networks and so forth, a new multimedia online project called the Berkeley Prosopography Service is also applying these techniques to a corpus of 700 cuneiform tablets. And in the university where I'm at, and my supervisor at King's College in London is also just finishing a comprehensive digital prosopography of the Roman Republic, which I've worked on and tweaked because some of the colors he was using was a little bit odd, which should be available online in the next few months, which is available to anybody online. Right, so that is the little bit of formal aspect. Now on to the methodology that I used for my project. So how can ancient networks be identified? What forms did they take and on what scale did they exist? How were they structured and scrutinized and sustained, Were there any common patterns in their structure? In what ways did proximity or distance affect their development, growth, and sustainability? These are just some of the questions posed by historians who wish to work on social network analysis, and some of the ones that I asked myself as well. However, one of the things with social network analysis is that Harris Klein, who is one of the leading pioneers of social network analysis, made a really important point that networks are a tool and not the object of analysis. So you don't just create networks and that's it. You actually have to use them in your analysis in some way. Right? So because of the nature of my study, which is about reading letters, most of Cicero's letters have been compiled in terms of whether they're addressed to Atticus, his best friend, whether they're addressed to other friends and family members, or whether they are just addressed to common friends and so forth. Right? And it's in like 17,000 different volumes, and they're not chronological, most of them anyway. So I decided to use a relatively old source, which is Evelyn Shirley Shuckburgh's, which is from the 1910s, 1920s. And even though it is a little bit outdated or seen as outdated now, it is the only print still available where they are done chronologically. So all the letters are based from the start of the published letters that we have of Cicero all the way to the end by date, whereas the other publications are done according to Atticus and friends and so forth. And the reason why I chose these prints is because with my study, which is about a certain time frame, from 50 to 47 BC, I didn't want to have to go through 6 or 7 different volumes at the same time and choose one letter from Atticus in one book and one letter to Rufus in another at the same time and have to intercalate them all. So it was just so much easier for them to be in chronological order. I could see the pattern, I could see what was happening, I could discern events as they were unfolding, as opposed to looking at 6 books at the same time, which makes it more complicated. All right. As discussed, I decided to stop at 47 BC because after that, nothing really is discussed. Right? Cicero just mentions a few times that the events that he just went through were hellish, and that's about it. But there's nothing very interesting about that. Right? Right, so what I did is I read the letters from 50 to 47. There were about 250 in total, and I read them several times each. And I created these Excel spreadsheets, one for every year. So 50, 49, 48, 47, and then I made one big one that incorporated everything because I wanted to have an overall map of everything. In terms of the software that I decided to use, which was Gephi, which I'll show you how it works a little bit later, I had to have an ID label. The ID label represented the name that was going to be on the node on the map and so forth. So the ID label on column A is just the node that it is. The label is the name of that node. So you can see here that node 0 is Cicero, node 1 is Pompey, and so forth. Right? The mentions column is how many times they are discussed in the letters of that year. The Caesar-Pompey column is whether I could ascertain from the letters, and only from the letters, whether those people discuss supported Pompey or Caesar. Then the 2 column is how many letters were written to that person, and not everybody obviously mentioned has a letter written to them, because Cicero's publishing, well, the person who published Cicero's letters and the current volumes that we have of them, which is not all of the extent, all the ones that he wrote and published after his death, or were published after his death, didn't keep everything. So we don't have all the letters that he wrote to people. These are just the ones that have been published and kept for us. So, for example, you can see here that 3 people wrote to Pompey. Pompey wrote to Atticus 12 times. He wrote to Callius Rufus once, and so forth. The from column is who the letters are from. So obviously there are 21 letters. There are 24 letters in total in 50 BC. And then I thought, oh, if they mention something about that person, maybe I should write what they say about that person, because it might be interesting. So you can see in the identifier section, you can see that Pompey classifies Caesar as a rival. Dolabella is a son-in-law, received a legacy from Livia, so there's all this information that you can discern about the people. And then the citation column is the date that it was written in 50 BC, in this case in 50 BC, and then Schoberg has a numbering system for all these letters. So if I wanted to reference them later, for example, in whatever I wanted to reference them, that I knew which letter all these things come from. This is just one little picture of that 51. It goes on for quite a bit, but I thought you might get bored by that. So that's what I did with all the letters. And unfortunately, there were problems in the fact that Cicero and his friends were all quite intimate with each other, so they used only one name, and Roman names are quite long. They all usually have the same name if they're from the same family. So it took me quite a while to get used to reading them and understanding who they were talking about. For example, if you go down to line 10, note 8, it says M. Marcellus, which is Marcellus. They only referred to the name Marcellus, and there are 3 Marcelli at that time. All 3 were consecutive consuls from 51 to 48. It was a little bit tough to understand which one they were talking about, because they knew which Marcellus they were talking about, but when you're reading it 2,000 years later, you don't. So I did the one for 50 BC, and then I started the one for 49 BC and realized that the Marcellus they were talking about at 50 was somebody completely different in 49. So then I thought, oh, maybe there's more than one Marcellus. I had to go back and read all of 50 and realize there were 3 Marcelli. I was like, oh. So anyway, so I had to restart all of it, which was really irritating. But luckily I realized that in 49 rather than when I was doing it later on, because 49 is a really big year, as we'll discuss later. So that's that spreadsheet. The software also requires that you do an Excel spreadsheet for the edges and how they are connected to each other. So the spreadsheet, this one is really easy. All it is the source, so the node number, which refers back to the node number in this spreadsheet, so who you're talking about. So N0 here is all the ones that are connected to Cicero. And the target is where all of those arrows are going to go. So all of those different names, which relates back again to the ID number on the first one. The weight is something that I assigned personally. And then the type is directed, which it had to be for the type of software I was using. Right? And in terms of the weight, I want to discuss that. So what I did with the weight is every time that somebody was mentioned in one of the letters, they would get 1 point. And then I thought, well, how do I differentiate somebody who wrote a letter to Cicero or was written a letter to Cicero, or by Cicero, I should say, because that's obviously a lot more significant. You know, Cicero actually communicated with that person personally, whether they received a letter or wrote a letter. So I thought, well, if they wrote a letter or received a letter by Cicero themselves, then they would get 4 points. So that's a little bit more than just being mentioned. Hence, when you go to this one, the weight here is categorized by whether they just were mentioned or whether they wrote a letter or received a letter. So you can see Cicero's writing to N1 is Pompey, the weight of that connection is 14 because there were letters written to Pompey and from Pompey and so forth. Right? What does all that do? So, it'll be there in a second. So, all of that went into this software called Gephi, and Gephi produces things like this, which I was hoping for a bigger screen, but I've got some screenshots anyway. So, you input it, and I decided to use Fruchtmann-Reingold display. There are different types of display you can use in the software. Some create really spirally things, which look really crazy. Some condense everything into one big small circle and you can't read anything. Whereas I decided to use Fruchtmann-Reingold because it creates these connectional arrows, and this project is all about connections and the weight of those connections. So how important are they to Caesar? How important are they to Pompey? How important are they to Cicero, and so forth? I decided to assign big bold colors according to their affiliations. So anybody with a green arrow or a green node is somebody who supports Caesar. Anybody who is orange is a Pompeian, and anybody who is purple is either they are neutral, so they decided to not back anybody, which is quite a lot, surprisingly, or I couldn't tell from the letters because it wasn't mentioned, and it wasn't mentioned for quite a few senators, and especially their children it wasn't mentioned for. There are some really key players in here, so obviously I'm going to discuss a little bit about Caesar, Pompey. Then there's one down the bottom, which is this one, which is Gaius Rufus, which is the person that Cicero writes to the most, apart from Atticus. And Atticus, if you don't know, is his best friend, complains to about everything, including the fact that he's cold at 9 a.m., but he's hot at 10 a.m., and he's thirsty at 11. And very boring. Atticus must have been so bored. But the really important thing is that Atticus is never connected to anybody else. Which I found a little bit surprising. I would expect Atticus to be connected to Caesar or Pompey because he's a very important person. He's very wealthy, he's very well connected, and even though he's not a senator, he's wealthier than most senators and has businesses with just about every senator in Rome, and he's extremely influential as an equite. So I was really surprised that there were no mentions by anybody else apart from Cicero. Okay, so the really good thing as well is that if you click, am I in the right screen? No. Is it going to work? No, I don't think it's going to work on this one because it's visualization rather than. Right, so sometimes it's tricky. There we go. Right, so let's talk about the results that I got. And we're going to do this very briefly. I'm not going to bore you senseless. All right, so these are the networks maps that were created. So this one is for 50 BC. You can see all the directional arrows. There's a really good one between, actually there's a few. If you look between Cicero and Gaius Rufus, for example, who I said was one of his main correspondents, you can see it's bidirectional, so the arrow goes back to Cicero. So you can see that he writes a lot to Cicero, which means the connection is very strong there. And you can also see the different strands that come off from not just Cicero, but other people like Gaius Rufus. He's connected to Caesar, he's connected to Pompey, he's connected to Domitius and Hannibarbus, to Piso, to all of these different people. And the good thing with Gephi is that it allows you to then focus on different people and not just on the central node. So what I couldn't show you because it's the visualization of up there into the projector, which couldn't do that. If I just clicked on Pompey, then it shows me only Pompey's links within the big network itself. All right, so you can see Pompey in 50 BC is only really connected to Cicero or Gaius Rufus. That's it. Right? He's not really discussed by anybody else. It's not even the start of the Civil War yet, so all it is just Pompey and Caesar are having a big fight about all these things, what's going to happen. Right? Caesar's is ultimately just as sparse. It's basically just Cicero talking about Caesar and what might happen. Carlius Rufus does the same. But then if you look at just Carlius Rufus, you see all of these different connections that he has. Right? He has connections to both people who back Caesar, so the ones in green, if you can see that, or the ones that back Pompey, which are the orange ones. And then you can see all of the other neutral senators in Rome and how he's connected to them as well. In 50 BC, there are a lot more connections between Caesarians than there are Pompeians, which I thought a little bit odd, considering Pompey is really the one that they all think is going to win. Right. So then I did one for all of the other years. This is 49 BC, and this is 49 BC is where everything happens. Right. So the Civil War starts in earnest. At the start of the year, Caesar crosses the Rubicon. He starts marching down all the way to Rome, and every Roman town is saying, "Oh, Caesar, you're our savior. Come and save us," and so forth. And you can see there are 130 different connections from the letters in 49 BC, which creates this really dense network. It's really hard to see. The arrows for Caesar, Pompey, and Atticus are really big. So what I decided to do is I took out all the people that were only mentioned once. And once I did that, it gets a little bit clearer to see. You can actually see names as opposed to the other one, which the names are just, especially the ones closer to the center, are really hard to see. So I took all of those single mentions out, and it doesn't really affect what I decided to do because single mentions aren't really going to be that important at the end of the day. It's more about those really big arrows, the big connections, the deep connections, and whether we can discern how they chose to back Caesar or Pompey, or whether they decided to remain neutral. And then if we look at individual networks for 49, Pompey's is a lot more extensive than the previous year. He has a lot more connections. He's connected to a couple of different families. So the Marcelli, which I talked about, there were 3 different ones, and there were senators from 51, 50, and 49. He's connected to the Ahenobarbus family. There are 2. There's the father and the son. The father supports Pompey, but the son supports Caesar, so it's really complicated. And then he also has connections to some of Caesar's aides, the major one being Balbus Major, who was, I guess we would say, an aide-de-camp now of Caesar, and basically was a negotiator for everything. Caesar didn't like to do things. He sent it to Balbus Major and Gaius Oppius, and they did it rather than him. Caesar didn't like to meddle. He just liked to basically march and look victorious. We see that. Caesar's is not as big, as I said, because Caesar didn't like to do things personally. He preferred to have Balbus Major and Gaius Oppius do all the dirty work for him. So his connections are quite small, especially, well, only in Cicero's letters, obviously. If we look at Carlius Rufus, remember we looked at 50 BC and that was really extensive. In 49, it's a lot smaller. And that's because Carlius Rufus decides to back Caesar, but he's not really that important. He doesn't really do anything. Caesar doesn't really trust him. He doesn't give him important jobs. And Cicero decides to really staunchly in 49 remain neutral. And he can't really abide by the fact that his best friend has decided to back Caesar, so they don't really communicate as much anymore. So you can see his network really diminishes from one year to the next. I just wanted to show you one more for 49, and that's Balbus Major. So his real official name is Lucius Cornelius Balbus Major. And he is Caesar's chief aide and financer in Rome. And the really important thing about this slide is the fact that you can see that he acts as a bridge between people and Cicero. Right? So as I said, Caesar, even though he writes a couple of letters to Cicero, he doesn't really like to do anything extensive in those letters. It's basically all about saying, Cicero, you're amazing, and that's it. And then the same day, Cicero would receive a letter from Balbus Major saying, yes, you're amazing, but this is what you can do for Caesar. And so Balbus Major really acts as a bridge between Cicero and everybody else that's really important in Caesar's camp. And you can see that in that network map, which you couldn't really see by reading letters and so forth. Right? Very quickly, we're going to 48 is a very small network. That's the entire year. And the reason for that is Cicero decides to finally back Pompey. He couldn't stay neutral any longer. Decides to back Pompey, much to his chagrin, and decides to move with Pompey to Greece, because Pompey has moved the entire Roman Senate to Greece because he can't trust Caesar with them in Italy. Cicero goes there, so he really has nobody to talk to anymore because all of his friends are with him, so we don't have any letters. And the few that he does write to those neutrals that stay in Rome are mostly about the fact that, can you make sure my family's okay, because otherwise they're all going to be murdered by Caesar. And you can see the network, therefore, in that year is quite small. At the end of 48, Pompey loses in Pharsalus, goes to Egypt, is decapitated. So we don't really see Pompey anymore beyond August, I think. And you can see here in 48, Pompey and Caesar have really small networks. And that's because Pompey is overseas, Caesar is basically running out of Italy because Pompey's left, so he's basically not fighting. Caesar goes up to Pharsalus, has a very decisive victory, and that's it. Right? There's no more, not much to discuss after that. Carlius Rufus in 48 is again quite small. He's a Caesarian, but halfway, about 2/3 of the way through the year, he decides to no longer be Caesarian because Caesar's going to put through a debt reform. And Rufus is heavily into debt, and the reform is not going to help him anyway. So he decides to go with Pompey, because if Pompey wins, maybe he'll just cancel all my debts rather than just some of my debts. And this is one of the problems with network analysis, is that it doesn't show when they change affiliations, like in 1 year, for example. It still shows Rufus as a Pompeian, so a green node and a green arrow, because it can't discern incremental changes, which is a bit annoying. What I could have done is maybe break it up into different sections of that year and show that he goes from green to orange because he backs somebody else. But that involves me doing a lot more work. And for the time being, I didn't really feel like it. So that's one important aspect. 47, as I said, 47, nothing major happens. The war between Pompey and Caesar is over. Pompey is dead. Hence, Pompey only has a very small connection. He's only mentioned once by Cicero in that he misses him. His friendship, not his leadership. And 47 is mostly about Cicero making sure that his family, as I said before, his family are okay, because he's stuck in Brundisium. Caesar won't let him into Rome yet because Caesar's not back, and he wants to make sure that he sees Cicero personally and forgive him personally. So Cicero wants to really make sure that his family in Rome are safe, so he writes all these letters to people who back Caesar and say, can you make sure that my wife, my daughter, my son are okay, blah, blah, blah. He writes to Terentia, his wife, and says, are you sure you're okay? I love you, blah, blah, blah. And she doesn't write back at all. Or we don't have those letters because maybe she wasn't nice enough to write back or didn't say nice things back. But we don't have them. All right. Very quickly, there's the big one for all of the connections from 50 to 47. There are a lot of connections. This one I decided not to take out single mentions because I really wanted to see what it looked like when everybody that was discussed in 50 to 47 and how they were all connected and so forth. Right? The good thing about that is you see Pompey over 50 to 47, all the different connections he has. They're both to his own supporters and to Caesar's as well, which is quite interesting. Caesar's throughout those 4 or 5 years doesn't really have that many connections, even though he ends up winning the war, as I said, because he really goes through negotiators and other people. We've talked about Carlius Rufus, that's just combining all his networks. They're quite diverse. He basically talks to and about people who support Pompey, people who support Caesar, people who are neutral, and tries in some way to get them all to fight for one side or stay neutral depending on what they want to do. And that's a really important aspect, is the fact that throughout all of the networks that I've created, you can really see that people didn't really care who other people backed. They still talked to them, they still wrote about them, or wrote to them, still received letters from them. So political affiliations really weren't that important. You didn't write to somebody only because they supported Caesar like yourself. You could easily write to somebody who supported Pompey and talk about everyday stuff. It really didn't matter, or it didn't seem to matter anyway. Right, so back to the formal bit, because I can't remember everything that I wrote. So, discussion. Won't go for very long, I promise. Right, so one of the main challenges of social network analysis using ancient sources is to bring the historical context back in after the formal analysis has been done. This is of particular importance in the study, as social network analysis has been used to scrutinise Cicero's letters from 50 to 47 BC in order to ascertain whether senators chose familial, social, or political affiliations in their support of Pompey or Caesar. So we've just discussed there were all these network maps that I created, discussed the fact that politics didn't really play a part in who they wrote and so forth. Right? But there are certain things that can be discerned from all those networks. Right? Social network analysis provides a way of visualizing complex social networks and sometimes enables a number of valuable perceptions into their structure and functioning to be discerned. So in this study, social network analysis has proven to be a valuable tool in identifying various traits of Cicero's epistolary circle that were not easily discernible from static texts themselves. Of particular note are the visualizations of familial connections that existed between individuals in Cicero's correspondence and the diversity of connections that some of these individuals also harbored. At the same time, however, there are several limitations to using this form of research. The first is the limitation provided by the ancient sources themselves. As previously mentioned, the use of social network analysis, the way it is intended to be used, a systematic analysis of the primary sources needs to take place before the analysis tools can be applied. Another limitation is that although social network analysis can provide valuable insights, there are some fundamental questions about the operation of ancient networks that social network analysis does not seem able to address. And both limitations are interlinked. If the source material is not scrutinized well enough to provide the information that will lead to the best visualization of that network, then the network maps created will fail to address some or all of the researcher's needs. These limitations and their implications only truly came to light when analyzing the network maps produced by Cicero's letters. The egocentric networks created were perfect for analyzing Cicero's own connections, but were either not ideal for displaying the multiple connections between other individuals, or questions posed of the source material, so that's me, and the input of this information into the software, again me, was not carried out to its full potential. I made the same mistakes as other historical researchers using social network analysis. I did not fully take the limitations of static historical texts into effect. The statements from the created network maps could definitely be made about connections between individuals in Cicero's social circles, as we've just discussed, but the various visualizations were not able to provide enough information or detail to conclusively state whether all of these individuals made their choice to support either Pompey or Caesar as a result of social, political, or familial affiliations. And that really comes down to the fact that a lot of senators, their affiliations were not discussed, hence there were so many purple arrows. And that's because either when they were discussing it between themselves, they already knew who they were supporting and didn't need to discuss it. Or there were so many people who were too afraid to come out and say, I'm going to back Pompey, I'm going to back Caesar, to put it in writing. And for the point of this study, that is a hindrance. Maybe Cicero himself knew everybody's affiliations, but we don't, just from his letters. Right? We've discussed the political aspect. It didn't really matter whether they backed Pompey or Caesar or stayed neutral. They still wrote to each other. They still discussed everyday things. They still, if one person backed Pompey, they would, write a letter. I was about to say email. Write a letter to somebody who backed Caesar and discuss what they were doing that day. What were your plans for the following week? Or what do you think Caesar's going to do next week? I think Pompey's going to do this. So there were really no problems in their political affiliations as to whether they still kept in contact and still created networks that way. The most significant political development in the first 2 years was defection. So I've talked about Callius Rufus's in 48, where he decides all of a sudden to back Pompey rather than Caesar, because it's not, for him, the best thing to do. He wants to get rid of all his debt. Caesar's not going to do that, so he decides to back Pompey instead. And there's another one, which I didn't discuss because his network is too small to create. And that's Labienus, who used to be Caesar's right-hand man in Gaul, decides to, when the civil war starts, stay with Caesar because he's been with him for about 10 years, and their family, some distant cousins of some kind. And then all of a sudden you see in 49, he just decides to back Pompey instead, and there's no discussion as to why he does that. Cicero doesn't know. He has a bit of gossip. I think it's about this, but he's not sure. Caesar doesn't discuss it at all. If you read Caesar's commentary of the Gallic War and of the Civil War, he doesn't discuss it at all. So it makes for really an interesting concept. Why did all of a sudden this one person who had been a staunch supporter of Caesar decide to go for the complete opposite person? And again, the network maps, because it's it encompasses the entire year, you can't really see the difference in terms of connectional arrows and networks and so forth. And that's one of the limitations of Gephi, is that it really can't differentiate what happens in a certain time frame unless you do incremental networks for every week, every month, or whatever, which just takes a lot of work. And then all it does is it displays it in this way. So maybe that's a limitation of the software, maybe that's a limitation of social network analysis, a limitation of what I chose to do, I don't know. It would have been really great to have it as a timeline, so for example at the bottom you have 48 and you have January, February and March and so forth, and then you can see how it all changes. But from all the different software packages that I looked at, all the different ways that I tried manipulating the data and manipulating those databases that I created, I couldn't get that to work at all. It was just impossible. You couldn't do it in a chronological order or a lineal fashion. Everything turned out as an egocentric network like that. So it was really impossible to do. Maybe I have to create the software. That's a lot of work. I might use my higher end mathematics though, so that's a bit tricky. But it just doesn't currently exist. You can't show things on a timeline in terms of social network unless you create daily, weekly, monthly timelines or social networks yourself. And then you place them on January, February, March, whatever. And maybe that's a possibility. Right? Let's skip right to the end. So, in conclusion, creating maps of related collectedness from social network analysis of Cicero's letters has resulted in some interesting insights. However, proving whether all senators were influenced by family or faction in their decision to support either Pompey or Caesar in their civil war has proven difficult. The source material, although very detailed in historical content of the period, was not able to provide enough information about the different types of connections, particularly political ones, between all individuals mentioned in the letters. Through the study of network maps, it was identified that particular individuals changed their affiliations for personal reasons. Some families were divided in their support. So we had some families where the fathers would back Pompey or Caesar and the son would back the opposite, or in a lot of cases the father would remain neutral and quite staunchly neutral and refuse to choose a side. And in most of those cases, the sons would actually go and back Caesar because they knew he was probably going to win because he had more, a bigger military army to back him, and Pompey seemed too afraid to do anything, hence why he left Italy. Moreover, social network analysis showed itself to be very useful in discerning familial and social connections, but not so practical in determining fluctuations of political affiliations over time. Maybe that is the limitation or an area for future development of using social network analysis on ancient sources. It simply cannot represent incremental changes within a large time frame, as I've discussed. However, what this study has brought to light is that using social network analysis on historical texts, such as Cicero's letters, needs careful consideration. The source material chosen and any social network analysis carried out on it should focus on the more social aspects of connections or aim to link individuals through familial connections rather than political ones. Thank you.